Smartphone cameras have come a long way. What started as a single lens slapped on the back of a phone has evolved into multi-camera setups with incredible features. But while the technology has been improving, sometimes the design, not so much. And so today, we're going to be taking a look at some of the ugliest phone camera designs ever made. Now, before we get into it, let me just say, this list is no way definitive. It's more so a mix of public sentiment and my own opinions. So if you happen to love one of the designs I mention, more power to you. Just because a phone has an ugly camera bump doesn't mean that it's a bad phone overall. Some of these phones are actually incredible devices. This video is more for looking back at some of the most head-scratching, bizarre, and over-the-top designs companies have come up with. So make sure to subscribe if you're not already, and let's jump into the list, starting with the camera design that's honestly grown on a lot of people, the iPhone 11. This phone might not seem like it belongs on this list today, but when it first launched, it was a whole different story. This was the first iPhone to feature a triple camera setup, and Apple's choice for how to arrange those cameras, well, it caught a lot of people off guard. Instead of lining them up vertically, like most brands were doing at the time, Apple went with this triangular layout that immediately drew comparisons to a stovetop. It was bold, weird, and to some people, just plain ugly. Now there's actually a reason why Apple designed it this way. They wanted to make sure that all three camera lenses were equally spaced apart and didn't take up too much space on the back of the phone. And honestly, it makes sense. But at first glance, it definitely wasn't winning any design awards. Over time though, the design grew on people, and now it's practically iconic. Apple has kept this layout for every Pro model since then, and it's hard to imagine the iPhone looking any different. But when it first launched, it was definitely one of the ugliest camera bumps we'd ever seen, and that's why I think it deserves a spot on this list. But let's move on to a phone whose design hasn't grown on anyone, the Nokia 9 PureView. If you've never seen this phone before, let me paint you a picture. 5 rear cameras, a flash, and a depth sensor, all arranged into a spiderweb-like layout. Oh, and no camera bump. It's all flush with the back of the phone. Sounds cool, right? Well, not exactly. The moment this phone was announced, people were immediately joking about how unsettling it looked. Some people said it even triggered their trypophobia, which if you're not familiar, is a fear of closely packed holes. And honestly, I kinda see it. The layout feels chaotic, like they just slapped lenses everywhere without a second thought. But surely with all those cameras, it took amazing photos, right? Well, not exactly. While it did combine the data from all 5 lenses for more detail, the results were inconsistent at best. Photos were hit or miss, especially in low light, and the post-processing took forever. So not only was it a strange design, but the performance didn't live up with the hype either. And to no one's surprise, Nokia hasn't revisited this design since. It's the kind of phone you look at and think, what were they really going for here? And honestly, I'm not even sure if Nokia knows the answer to that. Alright, let's move on to a phone that took inspiration from Apple's diagonal camera design, but somehow made it worse, the Tecno Phantom X2 Pro. The first thing that you'll notice is the 2 massive camera lenses sitting diagonally from each other. It's almost like they're trying to be bold and eye-catching, but instead it just looks awkward. And then you have the rest of the camera bump, which is this super rounded, almost bubbly shape that completely clashes with the phone's pretty square body. It's like they couldn't decide on one design language and just kind of threw everything together. To make things even worse, they added these tiny, randomly placed sensors within the bump. They're so small and awkwardly positioned that it makes the whole thing feel even more unbalanced. Honestly, it's hard to say what they're even going for here. If they wanted to stand out, they definitely accomplished that goal, for better or worse. But if you thought that was over the top, just wait until we talk about a phone with not 2, not 5, but 16 camera lenses. Yeah, that's right. Next up is the Light L16. Imagine a black rectangle with a ton of lenses scattered across the back in what I can only describe as a complete lack of organization. There's no symmetry, no consistent spacing, it's just complete chaos. If the Nokia phone was unsettling, the Light L16 takes that to a whole new level. The idea behind this design was ambitious. Each lens had a different focal length, and they were all supposed to work together to capture ultra-high resolution DSLR quality photos. Sounds impressive, right? Except it really didn't deliver. The processing time for photos was ridiculously slow, and even when it did work, the results were far from perfect. Visible stitching errors and inconsistent quality made the whole thing feel like a failed experiment. Even though this might not technically be considered a smartphone, it did run a version of Android and had many features of a phone, and honestly, the design's just way too ridiculous to not include. But let's move to a phone that took an iconic camera design and somehow made it worse, the Google Pixel 9 Pro Fold. For their second generation foldable, Google introduced a double stack camera bar. Imagine the usual sleek bar that you'd see on a Pixel, but now imagine if you cut that in half and put them on top of each other. And while the overall design of the Fold was a big improvement from the first generation, this camera bump felt like a step backwards. Now I get why this had to be. Foldables have tight internal space, and fitting a full camera bar across the back would probably have interfered with the hinge mechanism. So this double stack design was probably a compromise. But even understanding that, you can't really ignore how awkward it looks. Sure, the camera still performed amazingly, no complaints there, but the bump itself, yeah, it was not their finest moment. And so next up is a phone that tried to be bold and futuristic, but ended up looking more like a melted sculpture, the Oppo Find X5 Pro. Most camera bumps stick to a simple shape, squares, circles, and rectangles. But Oppo decided to go with something that looked like a tiny volcano erupting out of the back of the phone. The bump slopes up from the ceramic back panel in this weird, uneven way that's supposed to look seamless and futuristic. And while I'll give Oppo credit for trying something different, the execution just feels off. Instead of sleek, it looks like the back panel got warped in the manufacturing process. To make matters worse, they threw in some random text next to the cameras because nothing says premium design like awkwardly placed words. Seriously, a simple rectangular bump would have looked so much cleaner, but Oppo clearly wanted to stand out, and this was the result. And the ceramic material does make it feel high-end, but the camera bump, it's definitely one of the most bizarre and unnecessary designs I've ever seen. Speaking of strange and over the top, let's move on to a phone, one that takes over the top to the next level, the Huawei P70 Ultra. This camera bump is absolutely massive. It looks more like a mini camera module slapped onto the back of the phone rather than something that's actually a part of it. The bump itself is this weird triangle-like shape, but not in a clean geometric way. It's uneven, and the secondary camera sensors are just scattered in a way that feels completely unbalanced. They even added an extra little bump for the flash, because apparently the main bump wasn't enough. Now I'll admit, I do actually like the defined look of the main camera lens. It's big, bold, and feels intentional. But everything around it, that's where I feel the design falls apart. The awkward placement of the smaller lenses makes the whole thing look messy, and the sheer size of the bump is impossible to ignore. It doesn't just stick out, it dominates the entire back of the phone. But to be fair, the P70 Ultra does deliver incredible camera performance, so it's not like this is all extra real estate that went to waste. But the camera design just feels like it's trying way too hard, and instead of looking futuristic, it ends up feeling over-engineered. So while this phone might actually win in the photography department, it's definitely a contender for one of the ugliest camera designs we've ever seen. Smartphone cameras have definitely come a long way, but as we've seen, some of the designs don't quite hit the mark. From stovetop designs to spiderweb nightmares and everything in between, these phones definitely stand out, for better or for worse. Now just to be clear, a lot of these phones are genuinely great devices, and some of the design choices even make sense when you look at the technical reasons behind them. That said, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did I miss any camera designs that you thought were even worse? Or maybe there's one on this list you actually like. Let me know in the comments, I'm always curious to hear your opinions, and with that said, thanks for watching.